My son took every penny I had, my entire life's savings, to fund a grand European tour for his wife and her mother. He left me with nothing, not even a note, just a zero balance and the silence of an empty house. He thought he was starting a new life with my money, but he didn't understand that a father's love, when pushed too far, doesn't just break, it forges something else entirely. What followed was not revenge, but a lesson he would never forget. If you believe in karma and quiet strength, subscribe and support our channel. The day my world caved in, the air itself felt thin, like it couldn't hold the weight of my own breathing. I was sitting in my worn leather recliner, the one my late wife Sarah and I picked out 25 years ago. It was the centerpiece of our small living room, a silent witness to a lifetime of memories. In my hand, my phone glowed with a message from the bank, a single, brutal line that felt more like a punch to the gut than a notification. Available balance, $0. I must have read it a dozen times, the number refusing to change, the reality of it, a cold, heavy stone in my stomach. At 65 years old, after a lifetime of working with my hands, of grease under my fingernails, and the constant ache in my back from my job at the auto plant, that number wasn't just my savings. It was my security, my promise of a quiet retirement, the foundation I had built, brick by painstaking brick. I called the bank, my fingers fumbling with the screen. The automated voice was a sterile, unfeeling maze that eventually led to a human being who spoke with the same detached politeness. He confirmed my worst fears. A series of large wire transfers, totaling just over $90,000, had been made from my account over the past 24 hours. And the destination, I asked, my voice barely a whisper, a strange sense of dread already knowing the answer before he spoke it. The representative cleared his throat. Sir, the funds were all transferred to an account under the name of Leo Arthur Thompson, my son, my only son. Would you like to file a fraud claim, sir? He asked, his tone suggesting it was just another box to tick on his screen. I didn't answer. I just ended the call, the silence that followed roaring in my ears, louder than any machine I'd ever worked on. The house was still, save for the hum of the old refrigerator and the distant sound of kids playing down the street. It was the same silence I'd lived with since Sarah passed, but this was different. This was a hollow, echoing void. Just then, the landline on the end table, a relic I kept for emergencies, jangled to life, startling me. I picked it up. Arthur? Art, you there? It was my neighbor Frank, his voice booming with his usual cheerfulness. Hey, you won't believe it. I was just browsing online and saw some pictures from your boy, Leo. Looks like he's living the high life in Paris. Paris, France, can you believe it? Him, his wife, and the mother-in-law, all posing in front of that big iron tower. Must be nice, huh? I swallowed, the lump in my throat feeling like jagged rock. My soul seemed to detach, floating somewhere above my body, as I mumbled some excuse and hung up. I found my old tablet, a device I rarely used, and navigated to the picture-sharing site Leo had once set up for me. And there he was, my boy, Leo, the child I'd raised on my own since he was 10, after cancer took his mother from us far too soon. He was standing there, a flute of champagne in his hand, grinning from ear to ear. He had on a crisp new jacket, something I'd never seen before. His arm was wrapped around Chloe, his wife, who was beaming beside him. And next to her, looking smugger than ever, was her mother, Margaret. The caption below the photo read, "Embracing the good life in the city of love. New chapters and new beginnings." And beneath it, a comment from Chloe, punctuated with a little icon of a money bag. "To the man who makes it all possible." And a special thanks to the family fund for making dreams come true. I didn't feel anger, not at first. It was a strange, cold clarity, a feeling of watching a movie of someone else's life. I just stood there, the tablet feeling heavy in my hands, as a slow, quiet smile spread across my face. It wasn't a happy smile. It was the smile of a man who had just seen the final piece of a puzzle he had refused to solve for years finally click into place. The evenings in our little house felt longer after that. Everything was exactly where it had always been, but the meaning had been stripped away. The mantelpiece was lined with photos of Leo at 5, missing his 2 front teeth. Leo at his high school graduation, looking awkward but proud in his cap and gown. Leo on the day he got his acceptance letter to the state university, the first in our family to go. Every single choice I'd made, every extra shift I'd pulled, had been for him. When Sarah died, I promised her I would give our boy the world, or at least a world better than mine. I sold the one thing that was truly mine, my half-restored 1967 Mustang, the car I'd spent a decade collecting parts for. I sold it for a fraction of its worth because Leo needed the tuition money, and I didn't hesitate for a second. My son is going to be an engineer, I'd tell the guys at the plant, my chest puffed out with pride. He's going to build things, create a life I could only dream of. And he did get out. But he took a part of himself with him that I no longer recognized. He met Chloe during his sophomore year. She was polished, ambitious, with a family that always seemed to be living just slightly beyond their means. Her mother, Margaret, was a woman who could size you up in a single glance and find you lacking. The first time they came to my house for dinner, I saw it in their eyes. The polite, strained smiles as they took in my simple furniture, the old photographs, the faint, lingering smell of motor oil from my garage clothes. "Oh, Arthur, your home is so authentic," Margaret had said, her voice dripping with an insincerity that was sharper than any insult. Later, I overheard Chloe whisper to Leo in the kitchen, a comment I was never meant to hear but would never forget. "I just don't see how you grew up here. It's so small." From that day on, a quiet war of attrition began. Chloe, with Margaret's backing, started to gently, methodically, chisel away at the bond between me and my son. The distance didn't happen all at once. It was a slow erosion, like water dripping on stone. At first, the comments came disguised as concern, wrapped in the kind of modern jargon I didn't fully understand, but whose sting was unmistakable. "Honey, I love your dad, but do you think it's healthy for him to be so attached?" I heard Chloe say to Leo one evening when they thought I was out in the garage. "We need to build our own life, and his generation's way of thinking, that whole martyr complex, it just holds people back." Leo would offer a weak defense, something about how I'd always been there for him, but her logic was like a sweet poison, and he was drinking it down. "It's not about being there for him, Leo. It's about enabling him. We don't want our future kids growing up with that kind of scarcity mindset, do we?" She'd say things like that, planting seeds of doubt that I was somehow a weight, an anchor holding him back from the gleaming future she envisioned. Visits to my house became less frequent, replaced by stilted meetings in neutral territory like a coffee shop or a park. The excuses were always plausible. "We're just so swamped with work, Dad," Leo would say, his eyes never quite meeting mine. "You know how it is, trying to get ahead." I did know. I knew what it was to work until your bones ached, but this felt different. This felt like avoidance. Then it became an issue with my home itself. Chloe would complain that the neighborhood wasn't safe for them to visit after dark, or that the house had a musty smell that aggravated her allergies. Each excuse was a small, sharp paper cut, insignificant on its own, but together they left me bleeding. I accepted it all with a nod, a forced smile. I told myself this was just how it was when your son becomes a man, when he builds a life with another woman. You take a step back, you give them space. But deep down, I knew this wasn't about space, it was about erasure. Margaret, Chloe's mother, was far less subtle. Her words were always delivered with a veneer of politeness, but they were crafted to wound. During a rare family barbecue at their house, a sterile, modern place with a backyard that looked like it was from a magazine, she cornered me by the grill. "Arthur, dear, have you ever considered downsizing? Selling that old house? I mean, you have all that money saved up from the plant. You could move into a lovely retirement community, something more dignified. This area is just not what it used to be." I just looked her in the eye, my hands gripping the spatula. I didn't say a word, but in that moment, I understood. They didn't just want me out of their lives, they wanted what I had, the modest nest egg I'd built over 40 years. They saw it as a resource, not as the sweat and blood of my life. The final fracture, the one that shattered any remaining illusion, happened on a Sunday. Chloe had insisted on hosting a brunch. I waited for a moment when Margaret was in another room, and Chloe was absorbed in her phone, and I looked at my son, my voice quiet but firm. "Leo, are you happy? I mean, really happy? Do you see the way she talks to you sometimes? The way they both look at me, like I'm something they scraped off their shoe." Leo's face went pale. He opened his mouth to respond, but Chloe had already looked up, her eyes like chips of ice. The air in the room became thick, heavy, and then Leo broke. "That's it. I've had enough," he snapped, his voice louder than I'd heard it in years. "You're just jealous, Dad. You can't stand that I have another important person in my life. You've always tried to control me, to make me feel guilty for wanting more than you had." I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I just looked down at my plate of uneaten food, and in that crushing silence, I felt the last thread connecting us snap. When I left that afternoon, no one walked me to the door. No one said goodbye. I drove home, the familiar streets of my neighborhood feeling alien. I sat on the edge of my bed and tried to remember the last time Leo had said "I love you" without me saying it first. I couldn't. The weeks that followed were a quiet torment. Chloe and Margaret became a constant presence in Leo's life, and by extension, his finances. "It's just easier if I handle the bills, honey," I heard her tell him once. "You're so busy, let me organize things." He agreed, of course. Trapped by a combination of ambition and infatuation, he handed over the keys to his kingdom without a second thought. I started noticing small things, a change in his bank's letterhead, a request for me to co-sign a document he claimed was just for a new car loan. I knew something was fundamentally wrong, but I didn't have the language or the knowledge to prove it. That's when I decided to call an old friend. Mark wasn't just a guy from the plant. We'd started on the assembly line together 40 years ago. He'd gone back to school at night, got his accounting degree, and now ran a small tax business out of his home. He was retired, sharp as a tack, and the only man I knew who I could trust with this. "Mark, I need you to explain something to me," I said, sitting in his cluttered office, the smell of old paper and stale coffee hanging in the air. "How do you know if someone is messing with your money without your permission?" Mark leaned back in his chair, his expression serious. "Is this about Leo art?" I just nodded, the shame hot on my face. For the next few nights, Mark patiently walked me through it, showing me how to access my bank statements online, how to read the fine print. And when I finally saw the list of transactions, my world tilted on its axis. Small transfers at first, then larger and larger amounts, all moving from my savings to a joint account I didn't even know existed, an account in both our names. He asked for my details for some insurance paperwork, I mumbled, the words tasting like ash. "Art," Mark said gently, pointing at the screen. "This isn't paperwork, this is a pattern. He's been bleeding you dry." My heart didn't break in two, the way they say it does in songs. It didn't shatter, it simply hardened, turning from something warm and living into a cold, dense stone in my chest. I thanked Mark, shook his steady hand, and walked out of his office into the fading afternoon light. I didn't cry on the drive home. I didn't scream or punch the steering wheel. I just drove, my knuckles white, my gaze fixed on the road ahead. The truth of it, the raw, unvarnished treachery, was a fire that burned away all the softer emotions, leaving only a grim, quiet resolve. The son I had raised, the boy whose scraped knees I had bandaged and whose nightmares I had soothed, had systematically plundered my life's work. He hadn't just been manipulated by Chloe and her mother. He had been a willing, active participant in his own father's ruin. He hadn't just borrowed the money, he had stolen it, and in doing so, he had stolen a part of me. That night, my house felt like a stranger's. I walked through the rooms, seeing everything with a new, painful clarity. For years, I had been putting off cleaning out the small spare room, the one that had been Leo's as a teenager. It was filled with old textbooks, dusty trophies, and boxes of things he'd left behind when he moved out, promising to come back for them one day. A strange compulsion took hold of me. I wasn't cleaning, I was searching, though I didn't know for what. I pulled a heavy box off a shelf, a cloud of dust making me cough. Inside were old college papers, yearbooks, and a worn-out baseball glove. Tucked at the bottom, in a cheap plastic folder, was a stack of papers that didn't belong. I pulled them out. The heading on the top page made the air leave my lungs in a rush. Durable power of attorney. I sat on the floor, the bare bulb overhead casting long shadows, and I read. The document, filled out with dense legal text, granted the agent Leo Arthur Thompson sweeping powers over the finances, property, and even healthcare decisions of the principal me. And at the bottom, in the space for my signature, was a clumsy forged imitation of my own handwriting. My signature was more of a scrawl, worn smooth by decades of signing work orders and paychecks. But this forgery was hesitant, shaky. It was the signature of a thief, not a son. It was undated and clearly not filed, a draft of a deeper betrayal he was planning. He hadn't just wanted my savings, he wanted everything. He wanted the house Sarah and I had built our lives in. He wanted the power to pull the plug, to sign me away, to erase me on paper before I was even gone. I folded the document carefully, my hand steady, and placed it back in the folder. The cold stone in my chest now had a sharp, cutting edge. For weeks, I'd been ignoring a persistent cough and a weariness that settled deep in my bones, writing it off as the stress of it all, the burden of getting older. But this discovery, this new level of cold-blooded intent, made me realize I couldn't afford to be weak. I had to know what I was up against, not just with my son, but with my own body. The next morning, I called and made an appointment with Dr. Evans, a checkup I'd been putting off for more than a year. The clinic was sterile and smelled of antiseptic, a place of quiet anxieties and whispered conversations. I sat in the examination room, the paper crinkling beneath me, and answered his questions with a detached honesty. He was a good man, Dr. Evans, kind but direct. He listened, he nodded, and then he sent me for a battery of tests. A week later, I was back in his office, sitting in the same chair, the same faint smell of antiseptic in the air. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. He swiveled in his chair, folded his hands on his desk, and looked me straight in the eye. The compassion in his gaze was the kind a man gives another when the news is all bad. "Arthur," he began, his voice gentle but firm. "The tests came back. The scans showed some masses in your lungs. It's mesothelioma. It's quite advanced." He explained that it was likely from my years at the plant, from the asbestos that was everywhere back then, a silent killer we never thought twice about. "I'm sorry," he said. "We can start aggressive treatments, chemotherapy, but at this stage it would be about managing symptoms, not a cure." I just stared at a spot on the wall behind him, a small crack in the plaster that looked like a jagged river. I didn't feel fear or shock. It was as if I'd been waiting for the other shoe to drop, and it finally had. "How long?" I asked, my voice as calm as if I were asking for the time. Dr. Evans hesitated. "Without treatment, it's hard to say for sure. Maybe 6 months. Perhaps a little more, perhaps less." I nodded slowly. 6 months. A deadline. A finite amount of time to put my house in order. "I don't want the treatment," I said, my voice clear. "I don't plan on spending what time I have left being sick in a hospital bed." I walked out of that clinic not as a dying man, but as a man with a singular, unshakable purpose. The diagnosis hadn't been a death sentence. It was a starting pistol. I went home and made another call, this time to Vince Moretti. Vince and I weren't close friends, but we had a history. He was a retired police detective. I'd done some custom work on his classic Corvette for years ago. He was a bulldog, a man who understood the uglier side of human nature and knew how the system really worked. I met him at a quiet diner, the kind with cracked vinyl booths and weak coffee. I laid it all out for him on the table, the bank statements Mark had printed for me, the forged power of attorney, the whole sordid story. I left out the part about my health. It wasn't relevant to the task at hand. Vince listened without interruption, his sharp eyes scanning the documents. When I finished, he let out a low whistle. "Art, this is more than just a kid being stupid with money," he said, tapping a finger on the forged signature. "This is felony elder financial abuse. This is intent to defraud. This kid of yours, he was planning to strip you of everything." He looked up at me, his expression grim. "So, what do you want to do? You want to nail him to the wall, or you just want your money back?" I looked out the diner window at the passing traffic. "I want to teach him a lesson," I said, my voice low and even, "the kind he can't run away from. I want him to understand what he did." Vince nodded slowly, a small, knowing smile playing on his lips. "I think we can arrange that." That night, I went to the store and bought a simple hardcover ledger, the kind accountants used to use. It was bound in dark green leather. I went home, sat at my kitchen table, and on the first page I wrote in my clearest hand, "To my son, Leo, I gave you my life with love. You tried to take it from me with a pen. This is not revenge. This is an accounting. And by the time I'm done, the books will be balanced." The grieving father who had sat in the recliner, staring at a zero balance, was gone. In his place was a man who knew his time was short and who had nothing left to lose. And a man with nothing left to lose is a man who can do anything. The days that followed my diagnosis were not spent in grief, but in action. My grief was for a boy I had already lost. My actions were for the man who had taken his place. Vince Moretti didn't operate out of a fancy office. We met in his garage, a space that smelled comfortingly like my own, a mix of old oil, sawdust, and time. With a blueprint of my bank statement spread across a workbench, he laid out the strategy, his voice the low, confident growl of a man who had spent 30 years navigating the dark alleys of the law. "Look, Art," he said, tapping a thick finger on a large transfer. "We don't go to the local cops with this. They'll file a report, and it'll get lost in a pile of paperwork. We go straight to the head of the snake, the bank's corporate fraud division. These guys hate getting their pockets picked, especially when it crosses international lines. It makes them look bad." He explained that an immediate arrest was the last thing we wanted. That would make Leo a victim in his own mind, a cornered animal lashing out. The goal was to let him think he had gotten away with it, to let him get comfortable in his new, stolen life. "We build a case so tight, so ironclad, that when we make our move, he won't have a leg to stand on," Vince continued. "We're going to dismantle his world piece by piece, from the inside out." Mark, my friend the accountant, had already done the heavy lifting, organizing every illicit transaction into a damning chronology. He created a timeline that showed the withdrawals escalating right after every visit or call from Leo, painting a clear picture, not of a misunderstanding, but of a calculated, predatory campaign. The final piece of evidence, the forged power of attorney, was our ace in the hole. It showed intent. It showed a plan that went far beyond just taking my cash. It showed he was coming for my home, my life, my very identity. Our first move was a visit to the downtown headquarters of my bank, a gleaming tower of glass and steel that felt a world away from my quiet street. I wore my good work pants and a clean collared shirt, but I still felt like a ghost haunting a palace. Vince came with me, his old detective's badge getting us an appointment with a vice president of security he knew from back in the day. The man's office was sterile and impersonal, with a large window overlooking the city. I sat there, a 65-year-old retired mechanic, and I laid out the truth. I didn't raise my voice or get emotional. I spoke with the calm, methodical precision I would use to describe a faulty engine. I presented the timeline Mark had made, the bank statements, and finally, the forged legal document. The vice president listened, his expression shifting from professional skepticism to grim focus. He examined the forged signature, then looked at my calloused, grease-stained hands. He knew. "Mr. Thompson," he said, his tone, "all business now. This is a serious breach. We will launch a full internal investigation immediately. Because the funds were wired to a foreign bank, We are obligated to file a suspicious activity report with the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. The process has begun. As I walked out of that skyscraper and back into the sunlight, I felt no elation, only the quiet satisfaction of a job begun. The first domino had been pushed. Meanwhile, a world away, my son was living a life of sheer, blissful ignorance. I knew this because Frank, my neighbor, would periodically give me updates, his intentions innocent, but the words like salt in a wound. Saw a new picture of Leo. Art. Him and Chloe are at some fancy museum in Paris. The Louvre, I think it's called. They're standing in front of that painting of the lady with the funny smile. Each night, I would allow myself a few minutes to look at the evidence for myself on my old tablet. The images were a study in blissful betrayal. There was Leo, grinning in front of the Eiffel Tower, the lights twinkling behind him. There he was again, raising a glass of red wine at a chic sidewalk cafe, Chloe clinging to his arm, her smile a perfect predatory crescent. Her mother, Margaret, was in many of the photos, her expression one of supreme, triumphant satisfaction. The captions were the worst, little daggers of cheerful arrogance. Living the dream we deserve, on a photo of them shopping. You can't buy happiness, but you can buy a plane ticket to Paris, and that's kind of the same thing, Chloe wrote under a picture of them eating pastries. They were performing happiness, broadcasting a fantasy paid for with my 40 years of 8-hour shifts, of aching muscles and missed holidays. I studied Leo's face in each picture, searching for a shadow of the boy I knew, a flicker of doubt or shame in his eyes. I found nothing. He looked happy, carefree, and utterly untroubled. He had walled off his conscience so completely that he could smile for a camera while the foundations of his father's life crumbled to dust. The sight of it didn't ignite a fire of rage within me. It quenched it, leaving behind something colder and harder. It solidified my resolve. This was no longer about a father trying to teach his son a lesson. It was about a man ensuring that justice was served. Still, the nights were the hardest. In the suffocating quiet of the house, with only the hum of the refrigerator for company, the ghosts would come. I'd sit in my recliner, the same one Sarah and I had bought together, and I'd see her face, her gentle smile. What would she think of what our son had become? The shame of it was a physical weight. I'd wander into Leo's old room and see the baseball trophy he'd won when he was 12, the posters still tacked to the wall, and I'd feel a profound, aching loss for the child who had vanished. These moments of weakness were dangerous, I knew. They could soften my resolve, make me second-guess my path. So I would go out to the garage, my sanctuary. I'd switch on the single bare bulb, and the familiar scent of gasoline and steel would ground me. I spent my days methodically disassembling and rebuilding an old Briggs & Stratton engine, my hands finding solace in the logic of mechanics. Every nut, every bolt, every gear had its place and its purpose. It was a world that made sense, a world of cause and effect, where every action had a clear and direct consequence. A week after our meeting at the bank, Vince called. "It's done," he said, his voice clipped. "The receiving account in Paris has been flagged. They followed the money trail. It's on an international watch list now. It's not frozen yet, we don't want to spook them. But the moment they try to move a large sum out of that account, especially to another country, the whole thing will lock down so fast it'll give them whiplash. The trap is set, Art. Now we just wait for the rats to go for the next piece of cheese." That very evening, a new picture appeared online. It was a shot of an airline ticket confirmation, Paris to Barcelona. The caption from Chloe read, "On to the next adventure, Spain, here we come." I looked at the picture, then slowly closed the tablet. I went to my kitchen table and opened my green ledger. I made a new entry, noting the date and the intended destination. The rats were getting hungry. The storm was coming, and they were flying directly into it, chasing the sun, completely unaware of the darkness they had left behind, the darkness that was now patiently, methodically following them. Waiting is its own kind of work. It's not passive, it's an active, grinding stillness that wears on the soul. In the 2 weeks that followed the setting of the trap, My life settled into a quiet, rigid routine. I'd wake before dawn, the cough in my chest, a familiar, rattling companion. I'd make coffee, sit at the kitchen table with my green ledger and read over the entries as if they were scripture. Then I'd retreat to the garage. The methodical disassembly and reassembly of the small engine became a form of meditation. Each part cleaned, each gasket replaced, each bolt torqued to its precise specification. It was a world of order and logic, a stark contrast to the chaotic mess of my life. The physical work was a blessing. It exhausted my body and quieted the ghosts that haunted the silent rooms of my house. But even in the garage, I could feel my strength waning, a subtle betrayal from within my own cells. The tools felt heavier some days, and a deep, bone-aching fatigue would settle over me in the afternoons, forcing me to rest. Time was no longer an infinite horizon. It was a currency, and I was spending it carefully. My only connection to the outside world, to their world, was Vince. He would call every few days with brief, clipped updates. Nothing yet. They're still in Paris. Looks like they're burning through the pocket money pretty fast. And Frank, my well-meaning neighbor, would occasionally stop by the fence. "Hey, Art, your boy's in Spain now. Saw a picture of him at a big church." All smiles. Livin' the life, that kid. I would just nod, a tight smile on my face, and retreat back into my fortress of solitude. The pictures kept coming, a relentless stream of manufactured joy. Leo and Chloe on a beach in Barcelona. Margaret sipping sangria on a sun-drenched balcony. They looked untouchable, wrapped in a bubble of my money and their own monumental selfishness. But I noticed a subtle shift in the photos. Leo's smile seemed more forced, his eyes a little less bright. He was often on the edge of the frame, while Chloe and her mother took center stage. It was a small thing, but it was there. He was becoming an accessory to their fantasy. One evening, while looking for an old warranty in the back of my desk drawer, my fingers brushed against a small, forgotten metal box. It was where Sarah used to keep important keepsakes. I opened it, and inside, nestled amongst old letters, was a small, folded piece of paper. It was a letter Leo had written to her for Mother's Day when he was 9 years old, a year before she died. The handwriting was a child's clumsy scrawl, the lines uneven. "Dear Mom," it read, "you are the best mom in the world. When I grow up, I'm going to be an engineer like you wanted and build you a big house with a garden so you don't have to be tired anymore. I love you more than all the stars. From Leo." I sat there in the dim light of the desk lamp, the thin paper trembling in my hand. A wave of grief, raw and overwhelming, washed over me. It wasn't for Sarah, not this time. It was for the boy who wrote that letter, the boy who believed in love and loyalty, the boy who wanted to protect his mother from weariness. Where did he go? When did the stars he loved so much get replaced by the cold, empty glitter of money? The answer to that question arrived 2 days later, in a phone call from Vince. His voice was different, stripped of its usual gruff confidence, replaced by something that sounded like genuine disgust. "Art, you need to see this," he said. "I've been digging, called in a favor from a guy I know who's a wizard with digital forensics. We got a look at some of Chloe's cloud backups. It's worse than we thought. Your boy isn't just the thief, he's the mark." I met him at the diner an hour later. He slid a tablet across the table, a series of emails open on the screen. They were between Chloe and her mother, Margaret, dating back months, even before the money was taken. The subject line of the first one was the Goose Plan. I read, my coffee growing cold in my hands as they laid out their strategy in chilling detail. They referred to Leo as the Golden Goose, or sometimes just the asset. The trip to Europe was never about a shared dream. It was stage 1. Stage 2 was to be executed in Spain. They had already opened a new private bank account in a small Spanish bank under Chloe's name alone. The plan was to transfer the entirety of my life savings into that new account, leaving the joint account with Leo empty. Then came stage 3. The final email, sent just 3 days prior from Barcelona, was from Chloe to Margaret. "He's getting moody, asking too many questions about the finances. I think he's starting to suspect something. As soon as the transfer goes through tomorrow, I'll tell him it's over. I've already got my ticket to London booked for the day after. You handle the story back home. Tell everyone he had a breakdown, that he became controlling and abusive. We'll be the victims. He'll be left with nothing, and no one will believe a word he says. My son, my foolish, blind son. He had bartered his soul for a woman who saw him as nothing more than a temporary key to a vault. My anger, which had been a cold, hard stone, now began to burn with a different heat. It was mixed with a bitter, terrible pity. He had betrayed me for this. He had thrown away a lifetime of a father's love for a woman who was planning to abandon him in a foreign country without a penny to his name. My mission was no longer just about balancing the books. It was about forcing my son to look into the abyss he had so eagerly leaped into. The next 24 hours were the longest of my life. I didn't go to the garage. I sat in my recliner, staring at the phone, waiting. I knew the exact moment it would happen. Vince had explained that the international alert was a tripwire. The second, a transfer was initiated to move the entire sum to a new, unverified account. The system would automatically freeze everything. The account, the cards, every last dollar would become inaccessible. Late the next afternoon, my phone rang. It was Vince. "Bingo," he said, and I could hear the grim satisfaction in his voice. They took the bait. The transfer was attempted 30 minutes ago from a bank in Barcelona. The account is now completely locked down. International fraud alert. They can't access a single cent. Welcome to hell, kids. After I hung up, I walked to the window and looked out at my quiet street. I imagined the scene in that Spanish bank, the confusion turning to panic, the declined cards, the frantic calls, the accusations flying between them, the ugly truth of their partnership finally laid bare. The bubble hadn't just burst, it had vaporized. I felt no joy, I felt no triumph. I just felt the immense, soul-crushing weight of it all. I opened my green ledger. On a clean page, I wrote the date, the time, and a single sentence. The lesson begins. The chickens had come home to roost, and they were about to find that the coop was empty. The silence in the house after Vince's call was different. It was no longer the hollow echo of absence, but the charged, humming stillness of a trap that had been sprung. For 2 days, I lived inside that silence, moving through my house like a ghost, waiting. The engine in the garage sat half-assembled on the workbench, forgotten. My work there was done. Now, all I could do was wait for the shockwaves of the explosion. I had triggered a continent away to finally reach my shore. I imagined the scene with a chilling cinematic clarity. The fancy restaurant, the card declined. The polite but firm, "I'm sorry, sir." The flush of embarrassment on Chloe's face, the flash of fury in Margaret's eyes. Then the frantic calls to the bank from a hotel lobby, the sterile, unhelpful voice on the other end, speaking of suspicious activity and international fraud protocols. The foundation of their fantasy life, built on my stolen money, had been turned to sand, and the tide was going out. I knew my son. I knew his first instinct would be denial, then blame. He would blame the bank, the hotel, a computer glitch, anyone and anything but himself. He would spend hours, perhaps a full day, trying to fix it, trying to regain control of a situation that had already spiraled far beyond his grasp. He would not call me, not at first. Calling me would be an admission of guilt, a confession that the world he had built was a house of cards. His pride, inflated by Chloe and her mother, would never allow it. So I waited. I drank my coffee in the mornings, the familiar bitterness, a comfort. I sat in my recliner in the evenings, listening to the tick of the old grandfather clock in the hall, each tick a second closer to the inevitable. My cough had worsened, and a persistent, sharp pain had taken up residence in my right side. I moved with a deliberate slowness, conserving what energy I had left for the final act. The call came on the third day, late in the afternoon. I was in the kitchen, washing out my coffee cup, when the landline shrieked through the house. The sound was so jarring, so violent in the quiet, that I nearly dropped the cup. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. I dried my hands slowly, deliberately, on a dish towel. I walked to the end table, my steps measured. I let it ring a fourth time before picking it up. I said nothing, just held the receiver to my ear, my knuckles white. For a moment, there was only static, the sound of an ocean between us. Then a voice, cracked and ravaged, a sound I barely recognized. It was a sob, a plea, a desperate gasp for air. "Dad, what did you do?" The question hung in the air between us, thick with accusation and a stunning lack of self-awareness. He truly believed he was the victim. I took a slow breath, the air rattling in my lungs, and when I spoke, my voice was a stranger to me, calm, steady, and as cold as the steel on my workbench. "I didn't do anything to you, Leo," I said, the words falling like chips of ice into the silence. "I just put a stop to what you were doing to me." A choked, hysterical sound came from his end. "They took everything. The accounts are frozen. The cards don't work. We're stuck here. Chloe and her mother, they left. They said you did this, that you ruined everything. They just left." He was unraveling, the carefully constructed man of the world, dissolving into the terrified child he truly was. The irony was a bitter pill. The women he had stolen for had abandoned him the second the money was gone. They had shown their true colors, just as the emails had promised they would. "Please, Dad, you have to help me," he begged, his voice breaking completely. "You always said you'd be there for me. I'm alone. I don't know what to do. They want to arrest me. You have to fix this." The words struck me, not with pity, but with a profound, aching sadness for the moral chasm that now separated us. He still didn't get it. He saw this as a problem to be solved, a mess for his old man to clean up, not a consequence to be faced. "I was always there for you, Leo," I said, my voice unwavering. "I was there until you stopped being there for yourself. You made this choice. You forged my name. You took my life savings to impress people who saw you as a walking wallet. This isn't a problem I can fix. This is a debt you have to pay." He started to babble, to make excuses, to promise he'd pay me back, but I cut him off. There was nothing left to say. There was only one word left, the final, brutal lesson. "Learn," I said, and I gently placed the receiver back in its cradle, cutting off the sound of my only son weeping 3,000 miles away. I stood there for a long time, my hand resting on the phone. There was no victory in it, no satisfaction. Only the hollow, desolate feeling of a surgeon who has just completed a necessary but gruesome amputation. I had cut him loose to save myself, but also in the faint, desperate hope that the fall might teach him how to fly. I walked to the kitchen table and opened the green ledger. My hand was trembling slightly, but I gripped the pen tight. I wrote the date, and then, under the last entry I wrote, "The call was made. The lesson was delivered. The debt is his to carry now." I closed the book, the sound of the heavy cover shutting, echoing the finality of my actions. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat at the kitchen table with a pen and a single sheet of clean, white paper. It wasn't a will, and it wasn't a suicide note. It was an explanation, a final testament. I wrote not as an angry victim, but as a father, laying out the truth of his love and the unbearable weight of his disappointment. I wrote about his mother's dreams for him, about the boy who wrote her letters promising to build her a house. I wrote about the pride I felt and the slow, agonizing pain of his betrayal. It was the hardest thing I had ever written. When I was finished, I folded the single page, slid it into an envelope, and on the front I wrote his name, Leo. I would leave it in the ledger for him, for whenever he finally came home, not to absolve him, but so that he could never say that he didn't know. He would know what he had lost. He would know what he had destroyed, and that, I knew, would be the most profound punishment of all. In the quiet days that followed that final phone call, I found a strange kind of peace. The rage was gone. The deep, aching sorrow had softened to a dull, constant ache, and what was left was a quiet clarity. My life was no longer defined by what my son had taken from me, but by what I had taken back, my own dignity. I learned a hard lesson in my 65th year, perhaps the most important one of all. As fathers, we pour everything we have into our children, our sweat, our time, our dreams. We build a foundation for them, brick by painstaking brick, and we hope they build a good life upon it. But sometimes, in our endless giving, we forget to save a piece for ourselves. We forget that our love should not be a blank check for disrespect. Our sacrifice should not be an invitation for plunder. My actions were not born from hate. I could never truly hate the boy I taught to ride a bike. They were born from a love that was finally strong enough to say no. A love that understood that sometimes the only way a person can learn to stand on their own is if you stop holding them up. I had to let my son fall, to let him feel the full, crushing weight of his choices, because the alternative was to let him destroy us both. For any man out there listening to my story, for any father who feels invisible, who feels like he's become nothing more than a resource for his family, hear me now. Your life is your own. Your work has value. Your dignity is non-negotiable. It is never too late to draw a line in the sand. It is never too late to demand the respect you have earned. True strength isn't just about providing, it's about preserving your own soul. Let my story be a reminder that even in the face of the deepest betrayal, you have the power to reclaim your peace and write your own ending. Thank you for listening to my story. If it resonated with you, if you believe in the quiet strength it takes to stand up for yourself, please consider subscribing to our channel and hitting the notification bell. Your support allows us to continue sharing stories that matter, for men who have lived a life worthy of respect. We appreciate you being here.